I remember my name. That matters, I think, though I'm no longer certain why. The others forgot theirs within the first year willingly, gratefully even, but I held on to mine like a drowning man clutches driftwood. Sergeant Mikhail Voss, 3rd Reconnaissance Company, 47th Cadian Pattern Regiment, assigned to deep infiltration operations behind enemy lines. Those were the words they gave me when they pulled me from the standard infantry levy and inducted me into what they called, with bureaucratic precision, the Phantom Protocol. I did not understand what that meant then. I thought it was a promotion. I thought it was an honor. The facility where they processed us existed in no official records. I know this because I saw the data slate they used to inventory our equipment. When the tech priest's servo skull scanned our identification tags, the screen remained blank. We were already being erased, even before the surgeries began. The building itself squatted in the industrial wastes beyond the primary hive's lower levels, a grey cube of rockcrete that might have been a water reclamation plant or a promethium storage depot. The air inside tasted of counterseptic and machine oil, sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. That taste never left, even later, even when I breathed the recycled air of dead ships, or the poison wind of burning worlds. It became the flavor of what I was, of what they made me. There were 60 of us in that first intake. Soldiers selected for specific attributes. Endurance scores above baseline, psychological profiles indicating acceptable detachment from standard social bonds, and most critically, genetic markers suggesting compatibility with the augmentation suite. The Medicae Savita that examined me had dead eyes, not the glassy, unseeing dead of a corpse, but the deliberately killed eyes of something that had been human once and now was not. It pressed cold metal instruments against my chest, my skull, my spine, and I felt it measuring something deeper than flesh. When it withdrew, it made a sound that might have been affirmative, though its vocal synthesizer reduced all speech to a mechanical gargle. The attending officer made a notation on his data slate. I was approved. They explained the process in a briefing room where the picked screens showed diagrams of human anatomy with sections highlighted in red. A captain, whose face I can no longer picture, the first of many faces that would blur and fade from memory, spoke with the clipped precision of someone reciting liturgy. The Phantom Protocol, he said, was designed to create the perfect reconnaissance soldier. Operatives who could infiltrate enemy territory for extended periods, survive in hostile environments without resupply, and most importantly, avoid detection through a combination of augmentation and training. We would become ghosts, he said, and smiled as though he had made a clever joke. No one laughed. We had already learned that in the Imperial Guard, jokes were rarely funny. The first surgery took 16 hours. They did not use general anesthetics, something about maintaining neural pathway integrity during the installation, so they gave us a cocktail of tranquilizers and pain suppressors that left us conscious but disconnected, as though our bodies belonged to someone else. I remember watching my own chest opened like a cabinet, ribs spread with surgical clamps, and the glistening mass of my organs exposed to the sterile air. A magos biologis, face hidden behind an augmetic mask that hissed with each breath, reached into me with instruments that looked like the legs of mechanical spiders. I felt pressure, tugging, a sensation of things moving inside me that should never move. They were installing the first implants, subdermal transponders, metabolic regulators, adrenal enhancers, neural dampeners. Each one was a small miracle of technology, the magos explained in a voice processed through 3 layers of vox distortion, devices that would allow my body to function beyond normal human parameters. The pain came later, after they sealed the incisions and the drugs wore off. It was not the sharp, immediate pain of injury, but something deeper and more persistent, as though my body was arguing with itself about what it had become. The implants itched beneath my skin, a maddening sensation that could not be scratched. When I slept, I dreamed of insects burrowing through my flesh, making nests in my bones. I woke screaming 3 nights in a row before the dreams stopped, or perhaps before I stopped remembering them. The others suffered similarly. In the recovery ward, 60 men lay in narrow cots and made sounds that were not quite human. Whimpering, clicking, grinding teeth against the new sensations that colonized their bodies. One man, I never learned his name, began tearing at his own chest in the middle of the night, trying to dig out the implants. The Medicae servitors restrained him with efficient brutality, and by morning his cot was empty. We did not ask what happened to him. The second surgery came 3 weeks later, after they determined our bodies had accepted the initial implants without catastrophic rejection. This time they went into our heads. I remember the drill's high-pitched whine as it opened a hole in my skull. They let me feel that, said it was important for monitoring neural response, and then the terrible, wet pressure as they inserted the cortical implants. These were the devices that would make us ghosts. Neural inhibitors that suppressed the natural electromagnetic field generated by human brain activity, making us nearly invisible to most detection equipment. They would also, the Magos warned with something that might have been sympathy, alter our perception of reality. The human brain, he explained, is not designed to exist in a state of constant signal suppression. We would experience side effects. He did not elaborate on what those might be, but his tone suggested we would discover them soon enough. He was correct. Within days of the second surgery, I began to see things that were not there, or perhaps I stopped seeing things that were. Shadows seemed to move with independent volition, pooling in corners even when the light sources shifted. Faces became difficult to focus on, their features sliding and rearranging like images reflected in disturbed water. My own face, when I looked in the polished metal that served as a mirror, seemed unfamiliar, as though it belonged to a stranger who vaguely resembled me. The others reported similar experiences. We would be speaking to each other, and suddenly one of us would phase out of perception, becoming a blur in the corner of vision, present but not quite real. We learned to compensate, to trust our other senses when our eyes betrayed us, but the disorientation never fully left. We were being trained to exist in a state between presence and absence, and our minds resisted every step of the way. The physical conditioning began during recovery. They pushed us through training regimens that would have killed ordinary men, but we were no longer ordinary. The implants regulated our metabolic processes, allowing us to function on minimal food and water. We could slow our heartbeats to near-death levels, reducing our thermal signature to almost nothing. We learned to move in absolute silence, to control even our breathing so that no sound escaped us. They taught us to endure. We spent days locked in sensory deprivation chambers, weeks in hostile environment simulators, months in isolation cells, where the only sound was the drip of water and the whisper of our own thoughts slowly unraveling. I lost weight. We all did. The implants burned calories at a prodigious rate, and even with nutrient supplements, our bodies consumed themselves. I watched my arms thin to corded muscle over bone, my cheeks hollow, my eyes sink into deep shadows. We were becoming what they wanted us to be. Wraiths, specters, things barely substantial enough to cast shadows. But there was something else happening, something they had not mentioned in the briefings or the technical specifications. We were beginning to forget. Not the trained responses, not the combat protocols or mission parameters. Those remained sharp, burned into us through relentless repetition. No, we forgot ourselves, our histories, our identities, the small personal details that made us individuals rather than resources. I could remember my training but not my childhood. I knew 100 ways to kill silently, but could not recall my mother's face. The others experienced the same dissolution. During the rare moments we were allowed to speak freely, we would try to share memories, to anchor ourselves in our pasts. But the words came out hollow and unconvincing, like stories we had heard about strangers. One man, a former manufactorum worker named something like Jens or Jevris, spent an entire evening trying to describe his wife to us. He remembered she existed, remembered loving her, but could not picture her features or recall a single conversation they had shared. He wept with frustration, and we watched him in silence, knowing that whatever had eaten his memories was eating ours as well. They deployed us 16 months after the first surgery. By then, we barely resembled the soldiers who had walked into that grey building. We were thinner, quieter, stranger. When we moved, it was with an unnatural fluidity, as though gravity affected us differently. We did not speak unless necessary, communicating instead with hand signals and subtle shifts in posture. We had become efficient. We had become inhuman. They loaded us onto a transport, a standard Imperial Navy carrier, with rust weeping from its hull, and prayers etched into its corridors, and sent us to a war zone whose name I do not remember. The briefing officer, a different captain with a different face that I have already forgotten, explained that we would be inserted behind enemy lines to gather intelligence on Xenos positions and movement. It was the kind of mission ordinary soldiers performed in large, well-equipped squads. We would do it alone, in pairs, unsupported and unacknowledged. If we were captured, the Imperium would deny our existence. We were ghosts, after all, and ghosts cannot be captured because they were never there at all. My first mission partner was designated Unit 7B. I think his name before had been something like Artem, but he did not respond to it, so I stopped using names. We called each other by our unit designations, and after a while, that felt more natural than the names we had been born with. 7B was shorter than me, compactly built, with the same hollowed features and distant gaze we all shared. He had been a Medicae orderly before the protocol, and some residual knowledge of anatomy made him efficient at killing. We spent 3 weeks in the transport's lower hold, separate from the regular troops, and during that time we barely spoke. There was nothing to say. We checked our equipment repeatedly, ran through mission scenarios in our heads, and waited with the patient stillness of predators for our deployment. The insertion itself was routine. They launched us from low orbit in a drop pod designed for stealth rather than comfort. No retro thrusters, no impact cushioning, just ablative shielding and inertial dampeners barely sufficient to keep us alive. We hit the planet's surface in a forest region, the pod burying itself 6 meters deep in the soft earth. 7B and I crawled out through the emergency hatch, covered in mud and smelling of scorched metal, and began our march toward the target zone. The planet was cold, its atmosphere thick with industrial particulates that turned the sky a perpetual gray. The forest was not like forests on civilized worlds. The trees were twisted things, their bark black and weeping sap, their branches reaching out like the fingers of drowned men. Nothing grew beneath them, just bare earth and the occasional cluster of luminescent fungi. We moved through this landscape like smoke, our implants suppressing our electromagnetic signatures, our training suppressing every trace of our presence. We encountered the enemy on the 4th day. They were not the Xenos we had been briefed on. Those were further north, in the industrial complexes, but cultists, human traitors who had turned from the Emperor's light. They had established a camp in a cleared section of forest, crude shelters made from scavenged materials, cookfires sending greasy smoke into the grey sky. There were perhaps 20 of them, dirty and malnourished, their bodies marked with symbols that hurt to look at. 7B and I observed them for 6 hours from a concealed position, recording their movements, their routines, their weapons. Standard reconnaissance procedure. When night fell, we moved through their camp like ghosts. I still remember the first man I killed there, not his face, which was just another blur, but the sensation of my knife sliding between his ribs, the precise angle and pressure required to pierce the heart without allowing any sound to escape. He died silently, slumping forward into his bedroll, and I moved on to the next. 7B worked on the opposite side of the camp. Within 10 minutes, all 20 cultists were dead, and we had not fired a single shot or made a sound louder than breathing. We left their bodies where they lay and continued north. This was the pattern. Observe, record, kill when necessary, move on. We were not soldiers in any traditional sense. We were instruments of information gathering, and violence was simply another tool we employed. The neural dampeners kept us calm, kept us focused, kept us from feeling anything that might compromise efficiency. I remember thinking, during those first weeks, that the work felt easy, natural, as though I had been designed for this specific purpose and had finally found my correct function in the galaxy's vast machinery. The mission was supposed to last 6 weeks. It lasted 4 months. We went deep into enemy territory, deeper than any reconnaissance team had gone before. The neural dampeners allowed us to endure the isolation, the constant danger, the grinding pressure of operating alone in hostile space. We mapped enemy positions, identified supply routes, documented fortifications. We killed when necessary and hid when efficient. We became so proficient at invisibility that sometimes I wondered if we were actually still there, or if the protocol had succeeded too well and we had become genuine ghosts, spirits haunting a world that could no longer perceive us. 7B began to fade, even to my perception. I would turn to look at him and see only a vague outline, a disturbance in the air where a person should be. I assumed I appeared the same to him. We communicated less and less, until entire days would pass in silence, both of us moving through our assigned tasks with mechanical precision. 2 machines that happened to occupy the same space. The extraction point was a ruined cathedral in what had once been a settlement, but was now just rubble and scorched earth. We were supposed to reach it at the end of week 6. When we finally arrived, 4 months late, the extraction team was gone. The cathedral stood empty, its Gothic spires collapsed into the nave, its walls pocked with weapons fire. We found signs that a firefight had occurred here, spent shell casings, blood dried to black crust on the stones, and the charred remains of a corpse that might have been human or might have been something else. 7B examined the body with the careful attention he had once given to his Medicae work, but whatever knowledge he extracted from it, he did not share. We waited in that cathedral for 3 days, hoping the extraction team would return or that a signal would come through on our vox beads. Nothing, just the wind moving through broken stone and the distant sounds of war that never seemed to end. On the 4th day, 7B stopped moving. I found him sitting against a wall, his rifle across his lap, staring at nothing. At first I thought he was dead, but when I approached, his eyes tracked me with slow, deliberate movement. He opened his mouth to speak, and for a moment I thought he might say something important, might share some revelation or insight. Instead, he made a sound that was not quite language, a string of syllables that rose and fell with a rhythm that felt almost like speech, but conveyed no meaning. I waited for him to continue, but he fell silent, his gaze drifting back to whatever invisible thing had captured his attention. I left him there. There was nothing else to do. The protocol had taught us that individual survival was secondary to mission completion, and since the mission was effectively over, his survival and mine meant nothing at all. I left the cathedral alone. The walk back to Imperial lines took 2 weeks. Without 7B, without the mission structure, something in me began to unravel. The neural dampeners still functioned, still suppressed my electromagnetic signature and kept my emotional responses muted. But beneath that chemical calm, I felt something terrible stirring. It was as though a voice I had not heard in months was beginning to whisper again, asking questions I could not answer. Who was I? What was I? Where was the man named Mikhail Voss? And when had he stopped existing? I tried to remember my life before the protocol, but all I found was static, not the absence of memory, which might have been peaceful, but the presence of absence, the awareness that something had been there once and now was not. I had been excavated, hollowed out, and filled with something that served the Imperium's needs but bore no resemblance to humanity. When I finally stumbled into an Imperial outpost, the guards almost shot me. They said later that they could not see me properly, that I appeared and disappeared from their perception like a faulty pict feed. They thought I was a trick, a Xenos illusion, something hostile wearing human shape. It took the intervention of a commissar, a hard-eyed woman with a bionic arm, and a voice like grinding metal to keep them from executing me on suspicion of corruption. She listened to my report, such as it was, and then ordered me evacuated to the nearest command facility for debriefing. I was taken to another grey building that might have been the same building I had been processed in, or might have been one of 1,000 identical structures scattered across the Imperium's domains. They put me in a cell that was called a recovery room but had the dimensions and furnishings of a prison. I sat there for days, maybe weeks, while Medicae servitors examined me and tech priests analyzed my implants. Eventually, a man in the black uniform of the Officio Prefectus came to speak with me. He was tall and thin, his face sharp-featured and severe, his eyes the cold grey of gunmetal. He introduced himself as Interrogator Havoc, though whether that was his name or his title, I could not tell. He sat across from me in the small room and regarded me with the clinical interest of someone examining a specimen. He asked me questions about the mission, about 7B, about my experiences behind enemy lines. I answered as completely as I could, though I was aware that large sections of memory were simply gone, erased by time and neurological decay, and the relentless pressure of the protocol's modifications. Havoc listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a data slate. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, his grey eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Do you know what you are?" he asked finally. I did not know how to answer. I said I was a soldier. He shook his head. "You are a weapon," he said, "a tool designed for a specific purpose. The Phantom Protocol was never meant to be survivable. We knew the architects of the program knew that the augmentations would eventually destroy the host's sense of self. We knew that operatives would suffer progressive neurological degradation, memory loss, personality dissolution. We knew, and we proceeded anyway, because the tactical advantages outweighed the human cost." He paused, watching me, to see how I would react. I felt nothing. The neural dampeners made sure of that. "You were never meant to come back," he continued. "Ghost soldiers are expendable by design. You and your unit were expected to die in the field, either by enemy action or by simple operational attrition. The fact that you survived is problematic." He explained the situation with bureaucratic precision. The Phantom Protocol was classified at the highest levels. My survival meant that living evidence of the program now existed, and the Imperium preferred its more morally questionable projects to remain theoretical rather than testimonial. There were protocols for dealing with returned operatives, permanent reassignment to black sites, memory wipes, or in cases where the operative's degradation was too severe, merciful execution. Havoc studied my face as he spoke, looking for some reaction, some sign of fear or resistance. He found none. I had been trained too well. I was too far gone. "However," he said, leaning forward slightly, "you present a unique opportunity. Your implants are still functional. Your training remains intact. You are, effectively, a weapon that can still be wielded." He paused. "The Imperium can always use weapons. We will deploy you again, and again, until you fail a mission or until the degradation reaches a point where you become more liability than asset. At that point, you will be retired." He used the word retired in the same tone one might use for equipment disposal. "Do you understand?" I understood. I was property now, if I had not been before. I was a resource to be expended at the Imperium's convenience, and my consent was not a factor in that calculation. I thought, distantly, that I should feel something about this revelation, anger, perhaps, or despair, or at least resignation. But the neural dampeners kept everything smooth and calm, and beneath their chemical embrace, I felt only a hollow acknowledgement. This was my fate. I had accepted it the moment I walked into that grey building 16 months ago. Perhaps I had accepted it long before that, when I put on the uniform and swore the oaths that transformed me from a civilian into a tool of the Imperial war machine. They deployed me again 3 weeks later. A different planet, a different war, but the same mission parameters: infiltrate, observe, report, eliminate targets of opportunity. I went alone this time. The Phantom Protocol had shifted strategies after analyzing mission data. Solo operatives, it seemed, lasted longer than paired units. possibly because the isolation prevented the kind of psychological deterioration that came from watching your partner slowly dissolve into incoherence. I did not mind the solitude. By that point, human company felt alien to me, as though I belonged to a different species that merely wore a human shape. I moved through enemy territory for 8 weeks, sending encrypted burst transmissions back to command, killing when necessary, surviving through a combination of training and the inhuman advantages the protocol had given me. When the extraction signal came, I emerged from the wilderness like something that had never been fully alive, and they sent me immediately to the next deployment. This became my existence. Deploy, operate, extract, redeploy. Months blurred into years. I stopped counting missions after the first dozen. The worlds I infiltrated became indistinguishable from each other: grey skies, hostile terrain, enemies who were sometimes Xenos and sometimes human traitors, but always expendable targets to be documented and eliminated. I stopped trying to hold on to my identity. There was no point. The man named Mikhail Voss had died somewhere between the first surgery and the first mission, and what remained was something that wore his shape but contained none of his substance. I was Unit 3G, and then Unit 9A, when they reassigned me after a mission went badly, and then no designation at all when they decided I had exceeded my operational lifespan and removed me from the standard rotation. That was when they told me about the archive. The Phantom Protocol, it turned out, had been running for 11 years before my intake. I was not part of the first generation of ghost soldiers but the third, and each generation had been larger than the last as the Administratum scaled up the program in response to favorable tactical assessments. Thousands of soldiers had been processed through facilities like the one I remembered, their bodies augmented, their minds eroded, their existences erased from official records. Most had died in the field, as intended. Some had been executed when they returned too damaged for further use. A handful, like me, had survived beyond their projected operational lifespan and become statistical anomalies that complicated the program's neat actuarial models. These survivors, I learned this from a different interrogator in a different grey room, this one named Kale, or perhaps Kale, were kept in a facility that existed nowhere on any map. The archive, he called it, though it was not an archive in any conventional sense. It was a storage facility for broken weapons, a place where the Imperium kept operatives who were too damaged to deploy but too dangerous to release. I would be transferred there, KL explained, and held indefinitely. The alternative was execution, and while the Imperium was not sentimental, it was efficient, and resources should be expended completely before disposal. Perhaps my experience, my survival, held some value that could be extracted through further study. Perhaps the researchers who designed the protocol could learn something from my degradation that would improve the next generation. Perhaps I was simply being stored against some future need that might never arise. They transported me to the archive on an unmarked cargo hauler, locked in a cell that had no windows and no light. The journey took days or weeks. I had lost the ability to track time accurately, the neural dampeners having corrupted whatever internal sense allows humans to measure duration. When the ship finally docked and they led me out, I found myself in a structure that made the processing facility look welcoming by comparison. This was a fortress, built in the Gothic style that the Imperium favors, all soaring buttresses and gargoyle-haunted walls, but there was no grandeur in it, only oppression. The stones were black and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The corridors were narrow and cold, the air heavy with moisture that condensed on the walls and dripped constantly, creating an omnipresent sound of water striking stone. The guards who escorted me wore sealed environmental suits and communicated through Vox units, never speaking directly to me, never acknowledging that I was anything more than cargo to be delivered to its designated storage location. The archive's interior was a maze of cells arranged in concentric circles, descending into the earth like the layers of some theological hell. They took me down 6 levels, past sealed doors that bore warnings in Gothic script and high Gothic symbols I could not read. The air grew colder with each level, and the sound of dripping water was joined by other sounds, moaning, whispering, the occasional scream that cut off abruptly. At the 6th level, they opened a cell, a small chamber with walls of bare stone, a sleeping pallet, a waste reclamation unit, and nothing else, and pushed me inside. The door sealed with a pneumatic hiss, and I was alone in absolute darkness. I have been here ever since. How long? I cannot say. Time in the archive operates differently than time in the world above. There is no day, no night, no markers by which to measure duration. Food arrives through a slot in the door at intervals that seem irregular but might follow some schedule I can no longer perceive. Sometimes the lights turn on harsh, flickering luminators that hurt to look at, and I hear footsteps in the corridor outside, voices speaking in low tones, the sound of other cells opening and closing. Sometimes I hear screaming, and I wonder if it is coming from my neighbors or from myself. The neural dampeners still function, still keep me calm and distant from my own deterioration, but their effectiveness has diminished. I can feel things now that I could not feel before. Fear, loneliness, a desperate clawing need for human contact that wars with my training and my modifications. There are others here. I have heard them. The walls are thick, but sound travels in strange ways through stone, and sometimes I catch fragments of speech from nearby cells. They speak in the same disconnected way I do, their words lacking context, their thoughts fragmenting mid-sentence. One voice, somewhere to my left, repeats a string of numbers endlessly, coordinates, perhaps, or kill tallies, or simply the iteration of some broken mental process. Another voice, above me or below, I cannot tell which, weeps constantly, a sound so devoid of human emotion that it resembles machinery more than grief. A third voice, and this is the one that troubles me most, sometimes calls out questions. It asks things like, "Are you there?" and "Can you hear me?" and "What is your name?" I have never answered. I do not trust that the voice is real. I do not trust anything in this place. The interrogators come periodically, different men and women, though their faces blur together in memory, and I can no longer distinguish between them. They ask me questions about my experiences, about my missions, about the progression of my symptoms. They take samples, blood, tissue, cerebrospinal fluid, extracted with needles that penetrate the base of my skull. They run diagnostics on my implants, downloading data from the cortical interfaces, analyzing the way my augmentations have integrated with or corrupted my biological systems. They treat me with the same clinical detachment that the magos biologists showed during my initial surgeries, and I suppose that is appropriate. I am not a person to them. I am data. I am a case study in human degradation, a specimen preserved for future reference. Sometimes they leave me documents, old mission reports, personnel files, excerpts from technical manuals. I think they are testing me, seeing if I can still process information, if the skills the protocol burned into me remain intact despite the neurological decay. I read these documents in the brief periods when the lights are on, though reading has become difficult. The words seem to slide across the page, rearranging themselves when I am not looking directly at them. I have to trace each sentence with my finger to keep it stable long enough to absorb its meaning. What I learn from these documents is fragmentary but disturbing. The Phantom Protocol was more extensive than I knew, its reach spreading across dozens of regimental intakes, its casualty rate approaching 90% within the first year of deployment, its long-term survival rate effectively zero. I read about operatives who died in the field, their bodies never recovered, their deaths never recorded. I read about operatives who returned so damaged that they could not speak, could not recognize human faces, could not remember their own identities. I read about operatives who simply vanished, their last known positions marked on maps that quickly became outdated as front lines shifted and worlds burned. And I read, once, a notation about Unit 7B. He had been recovered from the ruined cathedral by a later extraction team, still alive but unresponsive. They had brought him back to the archive, placed him in a cell not far from mine, The report noted that he had ceased all voluntary movement, existing in a state of catatonic withdrawal from which he showed no signs of emerging. The notation was dated 4 years ago. I do not know if he is still alive. I do not know if I am still alive, in any meaningful sense. We are Schrödinger's soldiers, existing in a state between life and death, neither fully one nor the other, and the Imperium has sealed us in a box where no one needs to observe us long enough to collapse the waveform. I have begun to forget again. The small store of memories I managed to preserve, fragments of my early life, images of places I had been. The sound of voices I had known is eroding faster now. Soon there will be nothing left but the training, the protocols, the mechanical responses that the program burned so deep they became instinct. I will be what they always intended me to be. A weapon with no history, no context, no identity beyond its function. And when I have forgotten everything, when the last trace of Michael Voss has dissolved into the static of corrupted neurons and failing synapses, what will remain? Will there be anything at all? Or just a biological machine running pre-programmed routines until the power finally fails? I think about 7B sometimes, sitting in his cell in this same structure, staring at nothing, lost in whatever private hell the protocol created for him. I wonder if he thinks about me. I wonder if he can think at all, or if his mind has already completed the journey mine is still making, the transformation from person to object. I wonder if I should envy him. There is a certain mercy in complete dissolution, a freedom from the awareness of what you have lost. I am not there yet, but I can feel the destination approaching, can sense the final border between existence and something else, something that has no name because language belongs to beings with selves, and I am becoming something that has no self at all. The worst part, and I think this is the worst part, though my ability to judge such things has become unreliable, is that I can still remember caring, not about anything specific, but the act of caring itself, the capacity for attachment, for preference, for desire. I remember that I once looked at the world and felt something about what I saw, that events and people and experiences affected me in ways that went beyond tactical assessment. That capacity is gone now, or so eroded that it barely functions, but the memory of having had it remains. I am haunted not by ghosts but by the ghost of my own humanity, by the echo of what I was before the protocol hollowed me out and filled the space with machinery and training and synthetic calm. They will come for me again soon. The interrogators, or the medicae servitors, or perhaps just guards to transport me to a different cell, a different level, a different configuration of stone and darkness. I will go where they direct me because that is what I have been trained to do, and training is all I have left. When they ask me questions, I will answer as fully as I can, even though my answers make less sense with each iteration, even though the words I speak feel increasingly disconnected from any underlying meaning. When they take their samples, I will endure the pain with the same muted response I have shown to everything else, because the neural dampeners still work well enough to keep the suffering at arm's length, and what is suffering anyway when experienced by something that is no longer entirely a person? I want to end this confession. Is it a confession? A report? The mad rambling of a broken mind, with something profound, some insight or revelation that would give shape to the experience, that would transform suffering into meaning. But the protocol did not leave me with profundity. It left me with operational efficiency, tactical awareness, and an ever-diminishing sense of self. So instead I will end with a fact, simple and observable. I am Sergeant Michael Voss of the 3rd Reconnaissance Company, inducted into the Phantom Protocol 6 years and an unknown number of months ago, currently held in an unmarked facility at an unknown location for reasons that are classified above my clearance level. I have completed 17 confirmed missions behind enemy lines. I have eliminated an unknown number of hostile targets. I have provided intelligence that contributed to Imperial victories, whose details I was never briefed on and whose outcomes I will never know. I have served the Emperor faithfully, though I can no longer remember his face or recall the words of the prayers I once knew. I have given everything the Imperium asked of me, including the self that might have objected to the asking. I am a ghost soldier, and I have learned the truth that the designation contains. I am not a soldier who became a ghost, but a ghost who was briefly, almost accidentally, a soldier. The man I was is dead. He died in a grey building when they opened his skull and killed the parts of him that made him human. What remains is just aftermath, just the slow wind down of biological processes that no longer serve any purpose beyond generating data for future iterations of the program that destroyed me. If someone finds this, and I do not know how they would, as I have neither written nor recorded it, merely thought it in the darkness of my cell, while the walls drip and the voices scream, and the archive preserves us like specimens in formaldehyde, I would want them to know this. We were real once. The ghost soldiers, the phantom protocol operatives, the expendable weapons in human form. We were people before we were made into tools. We had names and histories and loves and fears, and all the small particular details that make a life worth living. The Imperium took these things from us, and we let them, because we believed in service and duty and sacrifice. We believed our suffering had meaning because it served a greater purpose. I no longer know if I believe that. The neural dampeners will not let me disbelieve. They keep everything too calm, too manageable, too distant to allow for true apostasy or despair. But in the small spaces between one moment and the next, in the gaps where the drug's effect falters before reasserting control, I catch glimpses of something that might be doubt. And doubt, I think, might be the last human thing left in me, the final ember of the fire that made me something more than meat and machinery. When that doubt finally dies, when the dampeners erode it completely, or when my mind decays past the point where such abstract considerations are possible, then the transformation will be complete. I will be what they made me. A perfect tool, perfectly loyal, perfectly empty. But I am not there yet, not quite. And in this last moment of something like consciousness, something like self-awareness, I choose to remember, to hold on to the ghost of who I was even as I become the ghost they made me. My name is Mikhail Voss. I am not a number, not a designation, not a function. I am or I was a person. And if this archive is my tomb, if these black stones and dripping walls are the only grave I will ever have, then let this thought be my epitaph. I existed. I mattered. I was real. Even if no one remembers, even if there is no one left to remember, even if I forget myself, I was real.